This is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, often referred to simply as the DRC. Despite their name, they are not a republic and are far from democratic. According to the World Democracy Index, which ranks countries by electoral process, civil liberties, functioning of government, political participation, and political culture, the DRC is the sixth most authoritarian country on earth. They are considered to be even more authoritarian than China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. They are the second largest country in Africa, falling only behind Algeria in terms of land area. They are also the fourth most populated African country, falling behind only Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Exact birth numbers are unknown due to poor internal record keeping, but the population is estimated to be between 100 and 105 million inhabitants. This makes them the most populated francophone country, beating out the likes of French Guiana, Canada, and even France itself. And despite the fact that many people have never even heard of this country, they're actually more important than you might think. They're considered the world's richest country in terms of natural resources, with an estimated value of $24 trillion worth of raw mineral deposits according to the World Bank. They also have the largest water reserves in Africa, with the World Bank saying that the DRC holds half of all water reserves on the continent. Despite this abundance of material wealth, it is estimated that more than half of the DRC's population lives without access to clean drinking water. You might be thinking, how is this possible? How could a country that has this much have so little? Well, the answer comes back, as always, to colonialism. From 1885 to 1960, the DRC, which went by a number of different names during this time period, was a European colony. But it wasn't typical. It wasn't a colony of a European country like most other colonies were. It was a colony of one man, King Leopold II. In 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium took control of the area that is now the DRC and claimed it as his own personal colony. Not a Belgian colony, his colony. Now, before we get into the history of the DRC's colonization, we need to talk about this man and the things that he did to the people of his colony. King Leopold II was the second king of Belgium, taking control of the country in 1865 after the death of his father, King Leopold I. He was just 30 years old when he took control of Belgium, and he was wildly ambitious. He was a young king with a young country, and he had dreams of expansion. Belgium was, and still is, a small country stuck between the much more powerful nations of France, the Netherlands, and Prussia, now Germany. King Leopold was obsessed with this idea of having a colony, and he thought it was the best way to show that Belgium was here to stay, and that he would be there at the helm. He first started by trying to buy a colony, namely Texas, the Philippines, and Sarawak, a Malaysian province on the island of Borneo. He was turned down every time and decided that simply buying a colony wouldn't work. He would have to take it. In 1875, he wrote a letter to one of his officials that said, "For the moment, neither the Spanish, nor the Portuguese, nor the Dutch are inclined to sell." Later in that same letter, he added, "I intend to find out discreetly if there's anything to be done in Africa." And that's exactly what he did. Sub-Saharan Africa was the perfect place for a budding young colonizer to expand to. Europeans at this time did not have a strong foothold in Africa yet, with 80% of the continent still being owned by locals, and with much of it actually being unmapped by Europeans. At this time in the late 1800s, Central Africa was the part of the continent that had been explored the least, and Leopold intended to exploit that. He funded major explorations into Central Africa and chaired a major conference on African exploration. This gave him the appearance of being charitable and philanthropic, while he was actually only doing it to feed into his own colonial ambitions. Perhaps one of the worst things about this is that he was successful. Even today, there are still statues honoring King Leopold in Belgium. As of 2020, there are at least 13 statues honoring Leopold II in Belgium, as well as numerous parks, squares, and street names. His efforts did pay off. In 1885, he took control of the DRC as his personal colony and named it Congo Free State. That's when the horrors began. But before I get into the specific atrocities that took place in the Congo Free State under Leopold, I want to talk about their journey from tortured colony to tortured country. Between November 15, 1884 and February 26, 1885, there was a conference in Berlin, Germany that discussed the terms and conditions of European colonization of Africa. This event was creatively named the Berlin Conference, and this conference helped kick off the scramble for Africa and ended with the signing of the General Act. This act did several things, including banning the trade of slaves in Africa. Chapter 2, Article 9 says that all countries that sign the agreement are agreeing to not trade slaves regardless of race. It also says that if a country does get involved in the slave trade, all other signatories must use all power at their disposal to put a stop to it. The agreement also recognized existing claims to regions in Africa. This includes recognizing British control of Sudan and Egypt, as well as French control of Algeria, Mauritania, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Benin, and Niger, many of which went by different names at the time. The reason I'm mentioning this act in this video is because this is the act that gave King Leopold exclusive control over the area that is now the DRC. It's important to note that the act itself does not explicitly mention Leopold II by name, but it recognizes the International Association of the Congo as having sovereign rights over the Congo Free State. This was a private organization that was personally owned by Leopold. For 23 years, the Congo Free State was controlled and run by King Leopold himself, and he exploited the land and the people for the labor and the material wealth, especially rubber. It's important to note that he immediately violated the General Act, and he enslaved nearly everyone in the country, including children. Though he did manage to hide what he was doing from his fellow rulers at first, the international community quickly realized what was going on and condemned King Leopold. There was mounting international pressure for Leopold to either improve conditions in the colony or to give full control of the colony over to Belgium, instead of him having personal control over it. Eventually this worked, and in 1908 he turned control of the colony over to the Belgian state, and then the colony was renamed the Belgian Congo. Thankfully, King Leopold also died a year after this happened. The Belgians made some efforts to improve conditions by building infrastructure like roads, railways, and hospitals, but overall living conditions in the colony remained mostly the same. Education was also expanded, but it still remained extremely limited. There was still intense and widespread racial division, and the Europeans living in the colony often lived in far better circumstances than the native Congolese. During World War I, the Congolese were forced to harvest raw materials to assist the Allied war effort, especially rubber and copper. Many Congolese were also conscripted into the Force Publique, the Belgian army in the Congo Free State in the Belgian Congo, and they were also forced to fight the Germans in German East Africa, which is the modern country of Tanzania. They were also forced to assist with the Belgian occupation of Rwanda and Burundi, which are now the independent countries of Rwanda and Burundi respectively, and sorry if I absolutely butchered that pronunciation. One estimate says that as much as 155,000 Congolese soldiers and workers may have died during the war because of starvation, disease, and fighting. During World War II, the Congolese were again forced to harvest raw materials for the Allies. This includes copper, tin, rubber, and especially uranium for use in the Manhattan Project. It's important to note that these workers were not given protective equipment while mining, which is dangerous in any kind of mine, but it's essentially a death sentence in a uranium mine. The Congolese were mobilized again during this war, being forced to fight in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Madagascar. These soldiers were often underfed, and the native Congolese were given less food so that the food could be given to the white Allied countries. It was around this time in the mid-1940s that the war had ended, and the soldiers returning home to the Congo were becoming resentful of their Belgian overlords and wanted independence, with nationalistic independence movements becoming more common and more violent. As pushes for reform became more common, the Belgians had an increasingly difficult time exerting control over the region, leading them to give the colony independence in 1960. A conference in January 1960 stated that June 30th would be Independence Day, and national elections were to be held in May. The elections went on as planned, and Patrice Lumumba was elected as Prime Minister. And then, unsurprisingly, things immediately fell apart. On July 11th, 1960, a politician named Moise Thombe, again, sorry for the pronunciation, took advantage of an armed revolt to declare that the province of Katanga would be independent. Katanga was one of the most resource-rich places in the DRC and perhaps even the world. They have significant reserves of copper, cobalt, zinc, manganese, coal, silver, cadmium, germanium, gold, palladium, uranium, and platinum, just to name a few. In response to this secession movement, Belgium sent in troops under the guise of protecting Belgian nationals. However, these Belgian troops landed in Katanga and aided the secession movement. Lumumba appealed to the United Nations to send troops to help reclaim the area, but the troops were unhelpful and undermined the authority of the DRC. With no other options, Lumumba looked to the Soviet Union to give him planes to help move his troops into Katanga. He asked for the leaders of independent African countries to meet in Leopoldville, the capital of the DRC, in August to assist with his reunification efforts. His move scared a lot of people, especially the supporters of President Kasavubu, who took a very moderate stance and favored some autonomy for each individual province. On September 5, 1960, Kasavubu dismissed Lumumba after public outrage. Lumumba claimed this was not legal, however, and continued to operate within the country. Less than 2 weeks later, both Lumumba and Kasavubu were removed from office by Colonel Joseph Mobutu, who was attempting to restore order to the country. By September, Kasavubu was reinstalled as president, and Lumumba was executed along with several other members of his cabinet. You might be thinking, what's the point in talking about this? This video is about Belgium colonizing the DRC, so what does some prime minister being executed have to do with that? It's not like the Belgians did it. Well, I decided to mention it because I think it proves a larger point. It shows that when colonization ended, most former colonies were not taught how to function as a proper state, and so they just quickly descended back into chaos. But now, let's discuss the specific living conditions that occurred under Leopold. Because under Leopold, the people of the Congo Free State, which was a population of about 10 to 15 million people at the time, were subject to extreme cruelty, even by European colonial standards. He originally told the locals, as well as his fellow rulers, that he was going to abolish slavery in the region, as many other empires had by this time. He also said that he was there to help and work with the people. This, as we now know, was far from the truth. He enslaved the population of the entire country, forcing them to harvest rubber for him. Originally, he would pay them just 1 penny for every pound of rubber they harvested, but then he quickly stopped paying them anything at all and opted to just threaten them instead. Then he took their land away, and if they didn't give him rubber, they wouldn't be fed. The Congolese were given significant rubber quotas that they had to meet, and the workers typically had to put in 20 hours a week of unpaid labor just to meet their quotas. They would then be forced to work in their free time in order to be able to afford food for their families. As sales increased for rubber globally, their monthly quotas kept increasing, and the punishment for falling short of the quota was physical or psychological torture, dismemberment, or death. Oftentimes, parents who failed to meet quotas would sacrifice the limbs and lives of their children instead, so that they could still work. This meant that parents were forced to make the decision to let their children get tortured or killed, or they get killed themselves, can't work to feed their family, and the family dies anyway. The image on screen shows a man looking at the severed hand and foot of his daughter, after she was taken away when he failed to meet his rubber quota. After her death, she was killed and eaten by Belgian soldiers, and at the time of her death, she was only 5 years old. It was expensive to ship bullets from Europe to Africa at the time, so Belgian soldiers would be forced to cut the limbs off the people they shot and killed to prove that they used the bullets in executions and not for hunting. However, some soldiers would still use the bullets for hunting, or they would simply miss the people that they were aiming at. In order to make it seem like the bullets were used in executions, soldiers would cut the hands and feet off of live villagers who hadn't done anything wrong. Men, women, and children fell victim to these corrupt soldiers. The picture on screen now shows a Belgian soldier pointing at the severed hand of a child. Leopold also ordered the creation of child colonies, in which Congolese orphans would be kidnapped and sent to schools operated by Catholic missionaries. There they would learn to be either slaves or soldiers. These were the only schools that were funded by Belgium. More than 50% of the children sent to these schools died of disease, and thousands more died in the forced marches into the colonies. In one of these marches, 108 young boys were sent over to a missionary school, and only 62 survived. 8 of them died a week later. Cannibalism also occurred regularly in the Congo Free State, with both the Belgian soldiers and the native Congolese eating the dead Congolese. The exact number is hard to find due to a lack of record keeping at the time and the inability to count the bodies now, but the number is often believed to be in the thousands. Technically speaking, cannibalism was illegal at the time, but Belgian soldiers rarely, if ever, faced repercussions for their actions. The Congolese, on the other hand, were often executed for cannibalism, despite the fact that they were only doing it because there was nothing else for them to eat. Protests and rebellions were also out of the question, as the population was weak and starved, and simply didn't have the strength to take on the Belgians. Because of this, the Congolese people were forced to turn on each other. There are records of villages that knew they wouldn't make the quotas, going on raids to cut the hands and feet off people from other villages to give to the Belgian soldiers. And it's not like gathering the rubber was an easy job either. The rubber had to be collected from vines, which often hung higher in the trees. The rubber that was lower on the trees was harvested immediately, and the vines higher in the trees were harder to reach. Oftentimes, the workers would just fall and die trying to collect these vines, or they would get injured, become unable to collect the vines, and be executed. In order to get just a little bit more rubber, many Congolese would chop up the vines just to try to squeeze out a little bit of extra sap. This strategy did work, but it ensured these vines could never be used again. So the Belgians ordered that no Congolese were allowed to do this, and if any of the workers were caught doing it, they would be beaten mercilessly or killed. It truly was completely helpless. Villages were often burned to the ground in deadly and savage raids. One Swedish missionary reported that 45 villages had been burned down in his area alone since he arrived there. Some of the villages were destroyed for almost no reason at all. Records show that one village was attacked by soldiers and 50 men were killed, with an additional 28 men being taken prisoner. The women in the village were tied together with chains around their necks and they were dragged out of the town. That particular village had met their rubber quota, and their recorded mistake was that the rubber brought by the villagers to the state was not of the best quality. Men, women, and children had been raped and killed for producing low-quality rubber. Overall, Belgium killed an estimated 10 to 15 million people during their colonization of the area. To put that in perspective, the entire population of Belgium today is only about 11.6 million people. The DRC has never recovered from their colonial history, and today the DRC is one of the most dangerous, violent, and war-torn places on Earth. The DRC today is in a state of complete disarray. They rank 4th in the Fragile States Index, and this index labels them as more fragile than Russia, Ukraine, Syria, and even Palestine. They rank 9th to last on the Food Security Index, being more food insecure than countries like Niger and Ethiopia. The country also has one of the highest rates of sexual assault in the world, and are sometimes referred to as the sexual assault capital of the world. They rank 180th on the Human Development Index, and they are considered to be less developed than Sudan, Syria, and Myanmar. The DRC needs the world's help. I know that if you turn on the news, your attention will likely be pulled towards the Russia-Ukraine conflict or the Israelis committing genocide against the Palestinians. But the people of the DRC still do need our immediate help. Currently, the average Congolese citizen lives on less than $2.50 a day, and a quarter of the population lives with a food security so low it is considered an immediate crisis by the UN. I know that in developed nations inflation is rising and the price of living is increasing. And I know it's hard, but if you can find a way to spare $5, $2, hell, even just $1, then you can help ensure that a child doesn't starve to death. Included in the description for this video is a link to the Democratic Republic of the Congo Humanitarian Fund, which is run by the United Nations. And if you can find a way to make a donation today, then I, as well as the people of the DRC, will be incredibly grateful. Hell, even if you can't make a donation, send a link to somebody that can, or post a link on your Instagram story. Do what you can to help word get out about this incredible organization. Thank you all for listening, and goodbye.